Hi, I'm Joel Richardson, and this is The Underground. Welcome to this week's episode of The Underground, a program that explores the testimony of the biblical prophets, the gospel of Jesus Christ, current events, and how these things relate to you and me. Now, in this week's episode, we're doing something a little bit different. We're joined by a fellow named Chris Date. Chris is, I don't know that he's necessarily the founder, but he is sort of the present steward of a website called Rethinking Hell. And Rethinking Hell is a website that sort of gathers together various thinkers, articles, podcasts, and so forth for those within evangelicalism that are considering or articulating the position called conditionalism. We'll get into conditionalism, but Chris, welcome to The Underground.
Thanks, Joel. I appreciate you having me.
All right, go ahead. I want to give you a minute just to tell the audience about Rethinking Hell, what you guys are doing. I don't know if I articulated it perfectly, but go ahead and give a little blurb for that.
I think you did just fine. We at Rethinking Hell are conservative evangelicals who are convinced that the authoritative and infallible Word of God does not teach the traditional view of hell, but teaches something, as we'll discuss, called conditional immortality. And the purposes of our website are primarily twofold. One is to promote that doctrine and to articulate and defend it. The other one is, and almost nearly as importantly, our desire is to improve the tone and tenor of the intramural evangelical debate over the nature of hell, which unfortunately too often seems to generate more heat than light. And so to that end, we have interviewed on our podcast representatives of all three major views of hell. In fact, I just wrapped up a series of interviews with the contributors to Zondervan's second edition of Four Views on Hell, including Denny Burke, who represented the traditional view, and we've also interviewed Craig Blomberg, Doug Wilson, and some others, and universalists, and of course conditionalists. And our hope is that what we are doing is modeling how it is as evangelicals we can disagree on this important topic, but a topic that isn't really worthy of division, at least if the reason people hold to them is for what they perceive to be biblical reasons, rather than various other less than stellar reasons.
So go ahead and explain to the viewers what conditionalism is. Briefly, if you could, realistically, we've got 25 minutes, and I'm hoping that we'll be able to hit on a lot of the important topics.
So, before I answer the question, what is conditionalism, I want to add just a little bit more flesh to the bones that you sort of erected in your description of traditionalism. And the reason this is important is because the traditional view is not one in which the lost are sort of disembodied spirits suffering in Sheol forever. The traditional view of hell is one in which, and we would agree with this part of it, incidentally, that the lost and the saved will one day rise from their graves bodily. The spirit of the breath of life will be breathed back into bodies that have been reconstituted, and people will be living, breathing, their hearts pumping, circulating blood, their muscles contracting, eyes moving in their sockets. These are living people. And the traditional view maintains that these resurrected living people will be, in effect, immortal, able to live forever in bodily, physical, and spiritual and emotional torment. Where conditionalism diverges from this, and the term conditionalism is short for conditional immortality. And the reason that it's short for that phrase is because we believe that, unlike the traditional view, immortality is something that God will grant only to those who meet the condition of being united in faith to Jesus Christ on the final day. And so immortality is not universal or extended to everybody, it's conditioned, hence conditional immortality. We believe that the lost will be raised, they will be bodily resurrected, but whereas Christians will be glorified, made immortal, incapable of dying anymore, the resurrected lost will remain mortal and will in fact die. And if, as dualism, classical Christian, almost Cartesian dualism would say, if bodies and souls are separated in the first death and the soul lives on, we would point to certain texts to indicate that the soul will die with the body in the second death, such that the consciousness of people has come to an end forever. And so in our view, the punishment, the final punishment of the lost, is as equally infinite or as equally eternal as the traditional understanding of final punishment is. It's just that we think the nature of that punishment is not life forever and torment, but death forever.
Gotcha. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's just jump in. Go ahead and define what is the Old Testament, because obviously this is the foundation for any discussion of this from a biblical perspective. What is the Old Testament perspective on the afterlife? How much information does the Old Testament really give us?
Well, I think the answer to that question is going to depend on whom you ask it of. I think that the Old Testament does not say a lot specifically about the nature of the afterlife. You have arguably competing notions. You have in Ecclesiastes, for example, the author saying that the dead know nothing, they can't praise God. Whether or not he's talking, however, about in this world, in the living earth, that's one possible answer to that question. On the other hand, you have passages in which people's souls or nephesh is said to depart. You have, David saying he would return, or Solomon would return, would go to meet his child who had passed away. And you have what I think is probably poetic language of the dead kings of the past rising up from Sheol to meet those who are dying. But I think that if we were to really say there was one really strong Old Testament evidence for something like consciousness after death, not talking about resurrection, we'll get to that in a second.
Right.
I think the best example of that's going to be in the so-called Witch of Endor,
right,
where you have Samuel apparently speaking consciously from the dead to Saul through the medium there at Endor. And what you'll find is that there are differences of opinion as to what that means, but I think that is the most challenging text for any of those, including myself, who would say that the Old Testament does not say that people are conscious after death.
Gotcha. Now, you don't have to dwell on it, but what's your perspective on that?
On that particular passage?
Yeah.
I haven't settled comfortably on an answer, but I think at this point I'm inclined to say that it was something like a vision. We have, for example, in the New Testament, we have Peter seeing the vision of the blanket coming down with the unclean animals on it, and it's called a vision, that the Greek word says. And very similarly, at the Mount of Transfiguration, you have Jesus, as recorded by Matthew, telling his disciples after what has taken place is done, don't go and tell this vision that you've seen to people. And so those of us who are called physicalists or who believe in something that is sometimes called soul sleep, we would argue that what's happening there on the Mount of Transfiguration is a vision. It's not actually taking place. It's a symbolic vision that's been given to the viewers. Now, I'm not saying that anybody that's listening to this right now has to buy that, but what I'm saying is that I'm inclined to think something like that is probably what's happening at Endor.
Right. Okay. And this, I think this, for the average Christian, that believes in traditionalism, this is almost a little bit shocking when they first hear this, when they say, wait a minute, you're telling me that the Old Testament, it never once refers to anyone going to heaven after they die.
I can't think of any off the top of my head, no.
Right, and I would agree with you, and this is, so and for clarity again, I agree with you. By and large, the Old Testament is largely silent, with the exception of Samuel coming up. That's an example of there being an ongoing consciousness of the soul or the spirit after the body has died, but there's not a lot of evidence for it. And in fact, even our hope, which our entire faith rests on, we believe in the resurrection of the dead. Even the resurrection of the dead is not a prominent, dominant theme throughout the Old Testament. You have really arguably 4 passages which speak of this, and there are even some who debate those particular passages. And so in a lot of ways, what you have in the Old Testament, and you can tell me whether you agree or disagree, is really the belief of the New Testament that's largely latent or in seed form. It's not really well developed. It's sort of hinted at in some places. I think you do have a few pretty clear references to the resurrection: Isaiah 26, Daniel 12. And I'm going to throw this out. This is completely irrelevant to the show, but you and I chatted a little bit beforehand, and I'm a staunch premillennialist, and you said you're an amillennialist.
I am.
And a partial preterist.
Although I hate the word partial, but that's another conversation.
Right. On the polemical side, we call them inconsistent preterists.
Sure.
But if you go back and you look at like Philip Maru, you look at Gary DeMar stuff, any of the partial preterists that deal with Daniel 12, they all say that does not refer to the resurrection. This is like the Achilles heel. Daniel 12, 1 and 2 is the Achilles heel of preterist, or one of them, because it clearly ties in the time of the resurrection of the dead with the events that he says, at that time there will be a tribulation, a time of distress such as has never happened. And it ties it back into Daniel 11 to the events of the Antichrist and all of these things. So that's completely irrelevant to the show, but I'm glad that you agree it's the resurrection.
Suffice it to say, I'm glad that I don't have to debate that issue in this episode of the show. Maybe next time.
Right. I'm always an evangelist. So please, I'm always an evangelist for premillennialism. So please chew on that later. But okay. So
Sure.
And then in terms of passages in the Old Testament that speak of potential, passages that are looked to as potentially speaking of an ongoing experience of the wicked after death in this sort of interim state between present death and the judgment that's to come. Really only two passages, arguably, or two passages that are often brought up, Isaiah 66 at the very end of Isaiah, and once again there in Daniel 12.
That's right.
Okay, so we begin obviously with this foundation. Anyone that's coming to try to understand what does the Bible say about the afterlife, about the state of the wicked after death, either in the interim state or after the judgment, we begin with the Old Testament as the foundation. Now, most often, again, a lot of folks will just sort of jump to the New Testament from there. To what degree, just in all of your studies and so forth, have you really dug into the intertestamental period and the impact that has had on the understanding of the New Testament, those that were, that Jesus was rubbing shoulders with, encountering the ideas that were popular in his day? Because to me, this is actually, from my perspective, this is actually the foundation of why I'm a traditionalist, because of the ideas that are developed in the intertestamental period. So go ahead and jump on that one.
Yeah, I think the problem is that depending upon which scholars of that period you talk to, you're going to get different answers. It is true that at least until the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, most traditionalists thought that the intertestamental literature exhibited a development of the doctrine of final punishment or of eschatology, in which which held that the lost would suffer forever in Gehenna. More recently, however, particularly after the discovery of the Dead Scrolls, we have found that the intertestamental literature exhibits a much greater variety of views. We certainly do have some who hold to some form of eternal torment, particularly Judith, for example, who takes Isaiah's scene that we discussed a moment ago and really changes what is being pictured there into something more friendly to the traditional view. But then you've also got authors who teach some sort of annihilation. David Instone Brewer, for example, a scholar at Tyndale House, Cambridge, and an expert in this kind of literature, argues that the most intertestamental Jewish literature actually teaches annihilation after a period of suffering. And furthermore, he argues that the language that they used is language that Jesus used and some of his contemporaries used to teach annihilation, in fact, as opposed to eternal torment. Meanwhile, you have people like Kim Papaiwano, whose recent book, The Geography of Hell, argues that the term Gehenna, as a word referring eschatologically to final punishment, actually underwent very little development between its use in the Old Testament, Jeremiah 7 and other passages, and the New Testament, and that Jesus is actually the first person to really use the term in this way, and he uses it in a way that is consistent with what it appears to be in the Old Testament, which is a valley in which dead bodies are laid out and consumed by fire and maggots. So it depends on what scholar you talk to, really.
Okay, so you've got some scholars that will say that the majority opinion during the intertestamental period, and again, for some that are not familiar with this, we're dealing with the deuterocanonical, apocryphal works, and then leads into what's called the pseudepigraphal apocalyptic works, which are books that are essentially written under the name or the title of some Old Testament saint or this sort of thing, but obviously wasn't them. And these are all works that have varying degrees of, I won't say authority, but they were respected and revered and so forth. And they clearly were formative in shaping the Jewish mind, again, in the first century that Jesus stepped into. Now, what about the issue of the rabbis, the Pharisaical schools? You had Hillel and Shammai. It seems to me, in all of my reading, that the majority position was that one, Gehenna, this literal place, this valley just south of Jerusalem, was in fact the location that the wicked would be sent to, and that they would be punished there either, it seems as though you have a period of 12 months, they would be punished for 12 months, and then some, they'll just cease to exist, burn up, and then others argued for an eternal punishment in Gehenna. And this seems to be the debate among the Pharisees that of Jesus's day that he was encountering. Would you agree with that?
I don't see any reason to dispute that. The only thing I would encourage listeners to do is to check out the writings of David Instone Brewer, in particular his chapter in A Consuming Passion, published last year by us at Rethinking Hell through Pickwick Publications, because he cites a lot. Goes really in depth into some rabbinic literature from the intertestamental period, and argues that there was certainly the debate that you're describing, but that the view that the loss would be finally annihilated was by no means a minority position.
Okay. Well, eventually annihilated, but this would be, even that position would be different than what you hold. Do I have that right?
Well, it would be different in certain respects, but in terms of what I think the crux of the debate is, as to the everlasting torment of the lost or their final destruction, I think that their view is ours.
Okay, so the eventual destruction. But, I mean, just for clarity, you would say that at the judgment, the wicked are resurrected into physical bodies, and pretty much they are immediately incinerated or destroyed, that it's not so much they're going to live for 1,000 years or 100 years. You would generally tend to see it take place at the judgment. Is that right?
I personally think that it'll be fairly swift, given that authors like Jude and Peter liken final destruction to the destruction of the inhabitants of Sodom and Gomorrah and the antediluvian population that was destroyed in Noah's flood. However, you will find that within conditionalism, there is a variety of views on this topic as well. You do have some who think that the lost will be kept alive for some longer, protracted duration. I think even, for example, going to as far back as Arnobius, who would say that, yeah, they're tormented for a while, they're kept alive for a while, and then eventually annihilated. And so there's really a spectrum there. Yes, I think it'll be swift, but I'm by no means a representative of the majority necessarily.
Okay. So obviously, we touched on the intertestamental period and the rabbinic thought that came out of the Pharisaical and the rabbinic thought that sort of came out of the intertestamental and the Old Testament period. And then you jump into the New Testament. And so for me, in order to even assess and analyze many of these statements in the New Testament, one really has to take the time to sort of work through the intertestamental literature to understand what ideas were common, what ideas were being circulated concerning issues such as Gehenna, concerning issues such as punishment and all of that sort of thing. And this often gives a lot of clarity to these statements. And possibly, as you mentioned in Judith, you have statements where the worm never dies and the fire never goes out, and then they suffer forever. So, you have some statements like that which could arguably give clarity to some of Jesus' statements. And again, this is how I take it. My perspective, again, is that when Jesus steps onto the scene and he's encountering these ideas, that he agrees with them and validates. He essentially validates the Jewish apocalypticism that emerges out of the intertestamental literature, that his perspective, because this is a debate within scholarship, some lean toward the idea, you go back to Schweitzer and these guys, and they're saying, well, Jesus was clearly a Jewish apocalyptic prophet. Of course, Schweitzer's a liberal, so he says he's an unbeliever. He says, well, but he was wrong, and he died, and they crucified him, and the whole project was over. But many evangelicals today will say, no, actually, Jesus was rethinking. He was reimagining all of this apocalyptic language, and he was actually speaking of a spiritual kingdom and all of these sort of things. I am of the opinion that Jesus was he very much espoused and agreed with and affirmed this Jewish apocalypticism, essentially that history is very linear, that it's leading up to the apocalyptic day of the Lord, which is a cataclysmic period, and all men will be judged. And then you have the judgment where he has been appointed by God to judge the living and the dead. Everything is laid bare. Deeds done in the darkness are shouted from the rooftops. The wicked are literally cast into Gehenna. This valley becomes the lake of fire and this sort of thing. So a lot of it is contingent on whether or not one accepts Jewish apocalypticism, or whether they embrace the idea that he was actually spiritualizing or viewing a lot of these things as metaphors or advanced metaphors and all this sort of thing. So if one affirms the Jewish apocalyptic worldview, which I do, and to be honest, I would probably say I'm a minority among evangelicals in that sense, but this really becomes the foundation for my traditionalism, because in my reading of, and I haven't read the fellow that you mentioned that you guys published, the ones I've worked through, some of the ones that are actually referenced by Fudge and so forth, I'm sure you're familiar, but Raphael, Jewish Views of the Afterlife. Are you familiar with that one? Okay, I bet you if I held it up. Does that look familiar?
It looks familiar, but I have not read it, no.
So he's, and then of course, this new fellow, Woodcock, sort of works through a lot of the material and so forth. So, in the bit that I've worked through, and I've also got the one that Fudge references, Nicholsburg, but I really haven't worked through that in much depth. My reading of that is that it was pretty clear. I mean, pretty strong language of torment, and it seems to be fairly consistent. I mean, throughout Enoch, and I won't go through all of them because there's a lot of material there. But then when Jesus steps in and he talks about punishment being eternal, he talks about when he says the maggot never dies and the fire never goes out and all this sort of thing, in light of the backdrop, to me, that's really the clincher. And because really, when you get to the New Testament, a lot of the language, it's just going to be, the conditionalists are going to say, I read it this way. The traditionalists are going to say, I read it this way. And it just seems like within the debate, it always just comes to loggerheads. It's like, I don't see it that way. And each side really can't convince the other. But for me, the clincher is to understand that backdrop. Does that make sense?
It makes sense, but like I said, the challenge you face is that the scholarship disagrees with each other, on this topic. Using the very language that you just used, conditionalists are going to cite their scholars, traditionalists are going to cite theirs. For me, the question is, what does the Bible really say? Because the scholars are going to debate each other on the intertestamental literature until the cows come home. Right. But when you look at the actual language that Jesus used, when you look at the language Paul used, when you look at the language from the Old Testament that they draw upon, when you look at the imagery that they draw upon, in particular in Revelation, what you find is that all, with virtually no exception, all of the texts traditionally cited in support of eternal torment prove upon even a slightest bit of closer examination to be much better support for conditionalism, unless it can be conclusively demonstrated that the intertestamental literature is in fact, pretty unanimous in regards to the final fate of the lost, in which case, I think conditionalism faces a problem. So until that intertestamental debate until a winner begins to emerge from that debate, I'm inclined to pay a greater amount of weight to the actual biblical text.
Right. Yeah, and obviously I agree with you. I mean, obviously it's all about the Bible, but a proper analysis and understanding of the Bible from a historical, grammatical perspective means that we understand the historical ideas that were, being discussed in this sort of thing. So obviously, I'm not saying it's not about the actual biblical text.
I know that the Bible is your authority. I'm just saying that we can only leverage the intertestamental literature so far, given the debate between the two sides of this. Well, given the debate between the two sides of that debate in terms of what the intertestamental literature taught.
Yeah, and I don't expect in my lifetime to see a winner emerge in that.
Neither do I.
In that discussion. So here's the issue. Before we get ahead of ourselves, this is the heart of the matter. So we've kind of discussed, we framed out the debate. As I shared with you on the phone, the reason that I'm personally so passionate about this, the night that I got saved, I mean, quite literally, I was an addict. I mean, I was a complete hedonist. I was a complete addict. I actually ended up in a tent revival meeting as a joke. I was driving across the country with a friend, and I actually got baptized because I was hot. And we pulled up to this grocery store, and I saw tent revival, and I just said, hey, I'm going to ask the preacher to baptize me. It was late August. I was in Memphis, and the whole thing was a joke. I ended up getting roped into this meeting, and actually tying into the cessationist issue. There's a lot of showmanship. There's a lot of craziness, but this one guy gets prayed for. He said he was blind, older gentleman. He goes out in the field. It's now at night. And I'm this, complete drug addict from South Boston. I follow this guy out into the field, and he's just belly sobbing in the grass out, past the cars. And I kind of interview him. And he said that he'd been basically blind from the time that he was a kid. And during the 10 minutes or so that we were talking, he just raises his hands in the air, just trembling. And he said, I can see the stars right now. And I believed him. And I went back into the meeting, and just the Holy Spirit just convicted me for the first time in my life. And what I felt as though he was convicting me of is essentially, he said, if you don't completely give your life to me right now, tonight, you'll spend eternity in the lake of fire. And I wrestled with him. I negotiated with him until I finally said, yes, everything is yours. And this weight was lifted, and I committed my life to him. But then even that night, I woke up in the middle of the night, and I just said, you just got suckered. You just went to a tent revival meeting, and you thought you got converted, and I'm wrestling. And the only thing that kept me in those months that followed was my belief that if I went back, it meant eternal torment in hell. Now, I know you'll say, well, God can use things that are not true for his own good, and I understand all that. But, if I were to say to you, listen, I believe the biblical testimony does in fact teach traditionalism. Because in the bit that I've interacted with some of you guys, Tim Story, we were kind of having a little Twitter back and forth, and he was just like, there is nothing more clearly taught in Scripture than the doctrine of conditionalism. And I was like, that to me, I was like, that is not helpful language. I was like, the gospel, I mean, there's clearly things that are more clearly taught in Scripture. And, my heart, my hope is that in our preaching, and again, I'm appealing on behalf of all of my friends that I grew up with, because they all say the same thing. Let me live my life. When I die, let me go to sleep. Let me disappear. Let me, be annihilated. Just let me enjoy life. I understand that this is an in-house debate and this sort of thing, but to what degree do you think it's important on your side as well? I can say, hey, listen, I could be wrong. I'm married. I'm wrong probably 80% of the time when I know I'm right. Anyone that's married knows this. But to what degree is it good to, as a conditionalist, approach this in terms of our preaching from this is my conviction, for instance, that conditionalism is true. However, to unbelievers, I could be wrong. This sort of thing, because this is, to me, the pastoral implications. And I know you don't choose a doctrine, obviously, based on, pragmatism. But in terms of pastorally, how it is proclaimed, what are your feelings on that?
I think that any Christian holding to any view of this topic needs to have an open mind and be willing to consider the possibility that he or she is wrong. He needs to understand that, unlike the Bible, he is errant, he is fallible, and the Bible is inerrant and infallible. And that as human beings, we have all sorts of biases and preconceptions and influences that cause us to misread the text. And the thing that seems clearest to us may, in fact, be not what the Bible teaches at all. So I do think we need to have that kind of open mind and gentle spirit and willingness to let other people disagree on this topic. That having been said, do I think that we need to sort of hold back how the language that we use in describing how clear we think the Bible teaches this or any other topic? No, I don't think that's the case at all. I think that if we're convinced that the Bible teaches us as clearly as it does almost any other doctrine, and I think that's true, then I don't think there's anything wrong with saying as much, as long as one demonstrates that he's willing to consider the possibility that he's wrong.
All right, folks. Well, I hope that this was enlightening and informative. As I said to Chris, I'll probably follow up with a couple episodes just sort of laying out why I am a traditionalist, why I feel as though it is what the Bible teaches. But for now, this is all the time that we have for this week. I want to thank you so much for being with us. I look forward to seeing you next week. I'm Joel Richardson, and this is The Underground.